for those of you that don't know me, my name is Emma Boucher, and I work alongside Nicola at New Zealand Christians in Science just with the student programs and the things we offer here. I'm also studying theology at Otago. So before we get into tonight's lecture, which looks very interesting, I just want to highlight some of the things coming up this year. I wrote it on my phone, all my notes, as I was spoon feeding to my children. I just tell this story because it's International Women's Day, but I just have so many things in my mind, like a lot of us do. Yeah, they're far too old to be spoon fed, but I just have to get it in and I have to get the notes down. But there's just the little details that I need to say. So we have our consciousness sessions coming up next month, but that will be on Zoom, and the registrations will be opening soon. We have our winter lecture series in August, and it's on science fiction and theology and science themes. So I can imagine most of us in this room love sci-fi novels. And then we have our conference in October on the fall, and so we also have a few occasional lectures coming up through the year. So all the dates and all the details will be on the website, and the website's actually kept up to date. So, and we send out a newsletter every month. So if you do want to receive that letter, that newsletter, just come and see Nicola or I, and we can add you to the list. So, okay, we're into that. So, into tonight. Tonight's guest is Dr. Joanna Leidenhag. She's a lecturer in theology and liberal arts at the University of Leeds. She has qualifications in systematic theology, theological studies, and modern history and theology. So we are in very experienced hands tonight. Tonight's lectures has come out of her work in her PhD and her subsequent books, Mind in Creation, Theology, Panpscyhism, and the Doctrine of Creation, and Creation and Ecology. So, broadly, sorry if I butchered this, Panpscyhism is the understanding that mentality is ubiquitous in the natural world and not limited to only humans and animals. So, if like me, when you first read this, you were like, what? Then you're in very good company, because we'll get to find out tonight, and hopefully be able to ask some questions. So, please welcome with me Dr. Joanna Leidenhag.
Thank you everyone so much for coming out on this lovely summer evening. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be here physically as well. It's absolutely wonderful. So if you'll forgive me, I actually thought I'd do something different from normal for me, which is to start with a very slight biographical indulgence. I'm not really old enough for biographical indulgences, but I thought it might be helpful to say something about how I came to the topic of theological panpsychism, in order to give some indication of what motivates me, what I'm committed to, what I hold a bit more lightly, and what my limitations are as a scholar. But after this brief biographical note, I will move on to give a definition of theological panpsychism, though I can't improve too much on what Emma said, actually. And I'll give some arguments for it, for why I think it's probably true, and conclude with some very tentative, and for me, preliminary thoughts on where this work might go in the future in dialogue with indigenous theologies and knowledges. So, in 2015, I started my PhD in systematic theology at the University of Edinburgh. This is the theology department in Edinburgh. It's always good to bring an old building to these talks. And a couple of months in, I found very little literature that I could engage with or build off for what was then my research question, which at the time was something along the lines of what kind of models could help us articulate the doctrine of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Completely different topic. And I could have stuck with that topic. I might have succeeded, we'll never know. But at the time, the risk of ending my 3-year program with very little to show for it felt like a genuine possibility, and I panicked. But in that course of initial search for literature on the Holy Spirit, I really stumbled across the work of 3 contemporary analytic philosophers focusing on consciousness, so the work of David Chalmers, Thomas Nagel, and Galen Strawson in particular, and they were offering contemporary analytic defenses of this ancient, and at the time, for many people still, rather wacky theory that consciousness is everywhere, what we call panpsychism. And that these defenses were coming from a notoriously disenchanted way of thinking, i.e. analytic philosophy, really intrigued me. There was nothing romantic about it. It was hard-hitting philosophy stuff. I should also admit that in those exact same months, my husband, Joanna Leidenhag, was finishing his PhD, more broadly in the field of science and religion, and his final chapter concluded that it was time for someone to seriously consider whether panpsychism was compatible with theology and science. So he passed on the baton, and I went to my supervisor and I said, "Can I do this topic?" And my Glaswegian supervisor said, "Okay." But he warned me not to get committed to this crazy theory, but to remain agnostic and maybe just weigh the pros and cons for people. We didn't know each other very well. I'd only been my supervisor for 3 months, but that was never going to happen. So I found myself increasingly ready to make the case that panpsychism, and theological panpsychism in particular, is true. I like to phrase it in terms of philosophically persuasive, scientifically plausible, and theologically beneficial. So I opened with this biographical sketch because after speaking on this topic for a few years now, I've learned that most audiences, at least in the UK, have this very clear mixture of people, most of whom have never heard of panpsychism, and goodness knows why they ended up coming to my talk. A large minority do know some things about panpsychism, but definitely think it's crazy. And then a very small minority, normally just 1 or 2 people in any given audience, are already really committed to panpsychism, normally because they've had a mystical or psychedelic-induced experience that means they feel they have direct perceptual awareness of the consciousness of the universe at large. So it's going to be quite a diverse audience, and I always think it's helpful for me to explain how I came to it, such that I'm not as certain as some audience members are, but I do think on the basis of philosophy and evidence that it's most likely going to be true. And I'm very committed to the idea that it's beneficial for Christian theology. Okay, so that's my biographical indulgence. Let's move on to why you're probably here. A bit psychedelic, aren't we? Yeah. To a definition of theological panpsychism. So, put more simply than this more precise definition, to help us get a general hold on the idea, panpsychism is the claim that all things, pan in Greek, have mentality, psyche. Right? But more precisely, panpsychism is a family of views, there's quite a few versions of it, that hold that mind is fundamental and ubiquitous feature of reality. So to claim that mind is fundamental is to say that mind cannot be explained in terms of nor reduced to anything non-mental. You can't, when you've got mental, you can't take that away to find something else beneath it, as it were. And this is in contrast to physicalists, but who claim that the mind reduces to physical stuff. It's also in contrast, however, to emergentists who claim that the mind can rise out of physical stuff, and if it's structured in the right way and suitably complicated. Dualists, substance dualists, who believe in the creationism about the soul, that God just kind of zaps fetuses to give them souls, but colloquially. They will also say that mind is fundamental. So we have a shared claim here that mind is fundamental. But obviously most substance dualists wouldn't say that mind is ubiquitous, so you need both these claims to be saying something different to mark the territory. So panpsychism can be a kind of substance dualism, a kind of like, let's spread the substance dualism around, right? But that's quite a rare position. Historically, you can see that position in the history of certainly Western philosophy, but today it's a very rare position. And most panpsychists today will say that there's just one type of stuff, and either that this stuff is just mental, so that's a form of idealism, or they'll say that there's one type of stuff, but it's both. It's psychophysical, and that's where I land. There's one type of stuff, but it's both. Sometimes this is referred to as a kind of what's called Russellian panpsychism, after the philosopher Bertrand Russell. And his particular version says that it's the inside of the stuff that's mental, and then the outside of the stuff that's physical. A bit like how most of us experience ourselves. Just applying that to everything. As a Christian, I like to express panpsychism in this kind of way. So, in the beginning, when God created everything from nothing, God created everything in one kind of instance by creating all the fundamental ingredients and grounds necessary for all the complex objects and conscious organisms to exist, live, and flourish. Which means that the universe was never, at any point, dead chunks of hollow stuff, but was always psychophysical, always containing experience, and some basic form of subjectivity, even if that's hard for us to imagine. So in this definition, that panpsychism is the view that the mind is fundamental and ubiquitous. One more word needs to be said about the word mind. So I talked a little bit about what fundamental means, but and ubiquitous. But what about mind? So first of all, mind, or psyche, or mentality, or soul, all these other terms in this field almost purely just connote consciousness. And in contemporary philosophy of mind, consciousness is even more narrow, really, to mean phenomenal consciousness. It's not phenomenal because it's really cool, it is pretty cool, but because, like the study of phenomenology, it refers just to felt experience. So it's the qualitative, subjective experience of what it's like to be you, what it's like to be a subject, to have a point of view on the world, to be, in some sense, awake. So it doesn't necessarily include all the bells and whistles that come along with being a human. So the good stuff like emotion and thought and cognition and love, and the bad stuff like existential anxiety. So none of that applies more widely, necessarily more widely. It might apply to some animals, but when we say that mind is fundamental and ubiquitous, it's really this narrow bit of the mind, the phenomenal consciousness. So let me give a little bit more of an example around that. If we are to interpret Jesus' statement in Luke 19:40, where he says, if these people were silent, the stones would cry out, if we interpret that with a panpsychist metaphysic, then it does not mean that the rocks were sitting there deliberating and waiting to see if the humans would shut up, and thinking about whether or not they wanted to join in. This anthropomorphic language would still have to be translated into something much more basic, but without losing that fundamental experiential unit that allows for that metaphor to be interpreted in a realist way. It's a realist claim, but not a grossly anthropomorphic claim. That would be my way of interpreting it. So-called subject panpsychists believe that even atoms, therefore, are subjects in a basic way, or even electrons. Some panpsychists still find this claim a bit much, and so they prefer to speak of proto-subjects, things that aren't quite subjects yet, but maybe could be when they grow up. This still means that the universe was never dead and empty, but the idea is it's slightly more intuitive or easier pill to swallow than saying that electrons are subjects, have a perspective of their own on the world. That said, the problem with this proto-panpsychism, as it's often called, is that it's really hard to say what this proto stuff is. It's not quite a subject, but it's also more than just dead matter. There doesn't seem to be very much middle ground there. So it sounds like a really, oh, that's going to be a much easier claim, let's go there, but then you ask for details and they're like, I don't know. So it depends which of those you're more comfortable with, basically. Okay, well, that's the panpsychism bit. All of that is the panpsychism bit. What's the theological bit? Well, this qualifier is something I've added to my own position to place panpsychism in combination with Christian theism and Christian monotheism. And that's because obviously panpsychism can be and has been across the world combined with all sorts of theories of religion and spirituality, from atheism to polytheism to pantheism to panentheism, you name it, it's done it. So the theological panpsychism for me means I'm attaching it to Christianity, but also even then a fairly one bit, a broad but not totally broad bit of Christianity, because to me the theological and theological panpsychism is a way also to affirm the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. So it's a way that I'm using it to suggest that consciousness is part of creation. It's made out of nothing by a totally transcendent creator. Consciousness is not, for me, how we cross the border or blur the line between the creator and the creation. It's just like matter, because they're the same thing, the one type of stuff. It's just on the side of creation. It is not, the soul is not a divine spark, on my view. And this allows me to really limit the theological consequences of panpsychism in a way that I think is important, such that, for me, adopting theological panpsychism had zero consequences for my doctrine of God. But it has huge consequences for my doctrine of creation, humanity, the church, the sacraments, and even how we might articulate salvation. So I think it's got some heavy lifting it can do for us, but for me, not in the Trinity or not in the doctrine of God. Okay, so that's my view. Why do I think it? Let's move on to some arguments for panpsychism. So throughout most of the modern period in Europe, panpsychism has been a small component of very elaborate metaphysical systems, thinking about things like absolute idealism or Whiteheadian process metaphysics, and it's often just one component of a much bigger complex view. This was the only way, I think, people were thinking about panpsychism in Western philosophy until a guy called Thomas Nagel, so I've given you the citation here, like a good academic. Thomas Nagel published a simple little essay with just the title Panpsychism in 1979, which disentangled panpsychism, tried to treat it as an isolated thing quite apart from these grand metaphysical systems. And in this pivotal essay, Nagel defined panpsychism as the view that, and I quote him, the basic physical constituents of the universe have mental properties. Still a pretty popular definition. And it shows that most panpsychists since Nagel, and this is in contrast to beforehand, aren't idealists. They're trying to keep both idealism and process metaphysics at bay. They're talking about substances, and they're talking about matter, as well as in panpsychists. So in his essay, Nagel works through 4 premises, each of which he says is almost certainly true, but when you add them together, you get panpsychism, and at this point he thought that was utterly bonkers. And so he was just laying out this problem that he could take all the steps, but then the conclusion to him seemed absolutely incredulous. He's come around since then. But I'm going to use Nagel's 4 premises to structure this section of my talk, Arguments for Panpsychism, though in addition to explaining each of these premises and building them towards, in a sense, one argument, the argument Nagel gives, I'm actually going to be scooping up a bunch of arguments on the way. Right? So, first premises, ontological materialism, or at least a form of monism. We've come across this one already. So Nagel affirms that human beings are, and he's at this point focusing on human beings exclusively, human beings are wholly composed out of one kind of stuff. We call this stuff matter. And in principle, we can swap our bits of matter with other bits of matter, and we still are us. In fact, we do that right about every 7 years. So he says there's one type of stuff, and we call it matter. So this mostly is a denial of substance dualism. We're just one thing. We're just bodies. And I actually think, although this is his first premise, and he does the least work to defend it, it's a pretty weakly defended argument in the panpsychist canon, because philosophers can fairly safely assume that most of their audiences aren't substance dualists, so they don't bother. Often there's little more than a gesture towards something like the interaction problem, or the idea that it's just inelegant if there's two things instead of one thing. And I don't find these arguments particularly convincing, but I don't think that's a problem for panpsychism, so I'm going to hold this premise a little more lightly than Nagel does, because as I've already said, panpsychism could just be substance dualism everywhere. But what I think panpsychists should be more strongly committed to is a kind of a weaker form of this premise, that however we explain consciousness has to be congruent with our explanations of our bodies and of physical and biological evolution of organisms. So even if we retain the categories of spirit and matter, even if we still find it helpful, as I think we do, to have at least two categories to speak about, two separate words, our explanations of either have to be unified. If we're going to explain minds, we have to be explaining bodies along the way, and vice versa. And these things are interwoven together. So that's the claim I think a panpsychist should be committed to, rather than this stronger claim. And this point about explanatory convergence between, in this case, philosophy of mind and evolutionary biology, is what Thomas Nagel focused on in his 2012 book, Mind and Cosmos, why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. It's a bit of a spoiler alert, isn't it? And here Nagel is drawing on panpsychist intuitions from many evolutionary biologists, early evolutionary biologists, people like Ernst Haeckel, William Clifford, Charles Scott Sherrington, Julian Huxley, and of course Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And the most famous argument for panpsychism from evolution was actually penned, however, by William James. And I'm going to read, I think he just said it perfectly, so I'm just going to read a fairly long quote from William James. He said, "If evolution is to work smoothly, consciousness in some shape must have been present at the origin of things. Accordingly, we find the most clear-sighted evolutionary natural philosophers are beginning to posit it here. Each atom of the nebula, they suppose, must have had an aboriginal atom of consciousness linked with it. And just as the material atoms have formed bodies and brains by massing themselves together, so mental atoms, by an analogous process of aggregation, must fuse together to form larger consciousnesses such as we know ourselves to be and we suppose exist in our fellow animals. Such a doctrine is an indispensable part of any thoroughgoing account of evolution." So that's William James. One of the most attractive insights for panpsychism for me was the idea attached to this, that if we're going to make progress on the mind-body problem, we have to stop treating it as if it's a local question that pertains only to humanity. If we're going to take evolution seriously, Nagel goes on to write, we have to confront the fact, and I quote him, "The mind-body problem is not just a local problem, but it invades our understanding of the entire cosmos and its history." End quote. So from the perspective of Christian teaching, I think this means we need to make sure that theological anthropology, our understanding of the human person, is probably complemented in, maybe preceded by, our doctrine of creation. And that contrary to the way much systematic theology has organized itself, the doctrine of creation needs to be dealt with, I think, first. Not before everything, but before humanity, certainly. And one of the chief theological benefits, I think, this gives us is a robust sense of kinship between humanity and the rest of the natural world. So we are not, on panpsychism, the only species that have spirit. We are not needed as a connector between creation and God. Creation sings the praises of God, and it laments the injustices of human behavior, and it groans and cries out for redemption, quite apart from us. And so I think we're here perhaps as leaders in creation's worship, or curators of that worship, but certainly the worship is happening anyway. And our worship is to join in with these myriad of other voices beyond the human. It is Jesus that is the mediator for creation, and we are not Jesus. Every part of us, our bodies and souls, are created, and this puts us in solidarity with creation. It doesn't set us apart. So for me, that's one of the big theological benefits. All scooped up quite a lot of things there in connection with this monism, this oneness. Let's move on to Nagel's second premise, which is much quicker, which is merely mental realism. It's shocking that he needed to say this and argue for this, and he actually needed to argue for this one a lot harder than he did the first one. You're really conscious. That's what that says. And regardless of our difficulty to explain that, it's still true. Consciousness is a property of the human organism, which means, as we've said, it's a property of a material being. For reasons broadly similar to Descartes, we should be more certain about mental realism than we should just about anything else. In a sense, this premise is just affirming that there's something that needs explaining. We experience the world and it's undeniable. So much for the first two premises. Now is when things start to get a bit more contentious in philosophy. Okay, his third premise is there's no psycho to physical reduction. So to reduce consciousness is to say that everything that needs to be said about consciousness could be translated into other terms. It could be reduced, explained away in this account. It can be put in physical terms, physical properties. This already begs the question, what counts as a physical property or a physical interaction as opposed to a non-physical one? And this actually is a really hard question, much harder than many people often realize. But my preferred definition of the physical is it's the sort of things physicists describe. There are other types of natural science too. So there are lots of properties that can be quantified and that are open to empirical investigation, and those are the things we call physical properties. The question is that all there is? And panpsychists, along with many other types of non-reductive views, will say that that this is great, physical properties exist, but when it comes to consciousness, you can have all the quantified empirical explanations you like, and you'll still be missing something. There will still be something left. In philosophy of mind, as I've said, there's been quite a lot of work shopping to try and get people to believe this. And it's often in philosophy done by thought experiments, that there's something left over even when all the physical facts have been accounted for. So most famously, Levine's thought experiment of Mary in the black and white room. Some of you might be familiar with this, the idea that Mary knows everything there is to know about the sciences of colour. She's a neuroscientist, she knows how the brain perceives colour, she knows how eyes work, she knows everything you could possibly want to know about colour, but she lives in a black and white room, and she's never been outside. And so the question in the thought experiment is, when Mary is let out of her black and white prison, does she learn anything when she sees a rose for the first time, or the sky for the first time? And I think most people, it's an intuition pump, this thought experiment, just say yes, there's something new that Mary learns, i.e. what it is like to see colour, even though she knew everything about colour already. Similarly, we have Thomas Nagel's earlier paper, What is it like to be a bat? And David Chalmers' famous zombie thought experiments, all trying to make exactly the same point, well, roughly the same point, that what it is like to feel consciousness, the first-person perspective, cannot be got at, even if we had the most perfect and complete description of the universe in empirical terms. And we don't even have that, so. And Philip Goff, who's a more recent and now kind of leading figure in the philosophy of panpsychism, he's written a really helpful article, and so I'm going to tell you, it's just called Panpsychism, and it's in the magazine Philosophy Now, if you want to go look it up. And he points out that physicalists may object at this point, because just because we haven't worked out how to give a mechanistic, mathematical explanation of consciousness doesn't mean we never will. So physicalists, reductionists might complain that we're giving up on science too quick and just running away into mystery. And I think Goff gives a really eloquent response to this worry that I thought, again, I would read verbatim. So he writes, however, to adopt panpsychism is not to give up on the attempt to explain consciousness scientifically. Rather, panpsychism is a scientific research program in its own right. Panpsychists do not simply declare that animal and human consciousness is a sacred mystery which must be arrived at by magic. Instead, they try to explain animal and human consciousness in terms of more basic forms of consciousness, the consciousness of basic material entities such as quarks and electrons. There's no reason to think that science must always follow a reductionist path. End quote. And then he appeals, it's quite a beloved example amongst panpsychists, to how electromagnetism has not been reduced to anything else, but in the 19th century, physicists just decided that it was better to posit electromagnetic forces and properties as fundamental, rather than keep trying to reduce them. And obviously the analogy goes, panpsychists are just doing the same thing with consciousness. But panpsychism isn't the only non-reductive view on offer. In addition to the substance dualism we've already encountered, there's emergence theory. And so in my work, I spend really the first chapter of the book arguing for why, specifically when it comes to consciousness, I don't think emergence theory is the way to go. And this is also Nagel's fourth and final premise. No to physical to mental, physical to psycho, emergence. I think emergence is extremely useful and probably true when discussing complexity and causal power of physical systems. And I think it's completely unhelpful and almost certainly untrue to apply that to the mind. And there are two reasons I think this. And the first is kind of a critique from the perspective of philosophy of science about what counts as an explanation and what doesn't. So emergence theory says that when a physical organism, and it thinks purely physical, nothing else interesting going on there, when a physical organism becomes sufficiently complex, boom, a radical, novel property emerges, experience, the ability to experience. And they also claim that this process is unpredictable. You can't tell in advance when it's going to be complex enough and when it's going to happen. By radically novel, I mean you can't even see this in a kind of embryonic potential in the simple physical base, right? It's not even there a little bit. It's not proto-panpsychism. There's nothing there, and then all of a sudden, it's awake. And the reason why emergentists insist on what seems, I hope you're probably thinking, why does it have to be so novel? Why is it so unpredictable? I think they have to, some kind of fuzz it a bit, but I think they really have to maintain that commitment to fend off the threat of reductionism. If they don't say that, they're going to be really vulnerable to saying, well, then we can explain it in all in physical terms. And that's the main thing they're trying to avoid. But of course, to say that something just poof appears like a rabbit out of a hat starts to look very much like magic and not very much like an explanation. So unlike reductionism and, as we've seen according to Goff, panpsychism, I think when emergence theory is applied to consciousness, it's not a scientific research program where you just need more time to fill in the details empirically about what's going on. Instead, I think this very, very strong form of emergence has already ruled out the search for an explanation. They've backed themselves into a corner in that regard. They cannot give us an account, and they refuse to give us an account of what would make sense of how and why certain forms of complexity give rise to certain forms of consciousness. Interestingly, though, by making this argument against emergence theory, atheistic analytic philosophers have ended up, I think, backing themselves into theism. They're adding quite strong support for a cosmological argument for the existence of God. So if emergence is wrong, because consciousness cannot appear as if by magic from matter that doesn't have any potential for it, then this same logical principle, if writ large across the universe, suggests that the universe cannot come from nothing, as if by magic, unless there is some power, some first cause that explains it and grounds its existence. And as Thomas Aquinas likes to say, this is what people refer to as God. This is quite a different theological picture then, than the one we get if we give theological endorsement to emergence theory. And that brings me to my second worry about emergence, not a worry about whether or not it counts as an explanation, but a worry about what it does to Christianity. So, and I came across this worry by really looking at the work of pretty eminent figures in the field of science and religion, people who I've learned a lot from, and I was reading them for a reason, right? And so I'm thinking of people like Philip Clayton, Arthur Peacock, Niles Hendrik Gregerson, Nancy Murphy, and Dennis Edwards. All of whom integrate emergence theory really heavily into their theological work. And I think that each of them, in slightly different ways, this has created a tendency to view God as an emergent property. And that is a pull towards a view that was officially argued for by a guy called Samuel Alexander in the 19th century. Whereby God is created by and emerges out of the evolutionary process. Now, this isn't a necessary entailment of emergence theory, but I think it's a real temptation that theologians should be wary of, and I think it creeps up again and again in the work of these scholars. So, these are Nagel's four premises, as we can see here, and I've scooped up and talked around them fairly freely. But where do they leave us? And if we take these four premises together, there's one type of stuff, consciousness is real, it can't be reduced, and it doesn't emerge. It's kind of a last man standing kind of argument. What do we say then? Well, we end up having to say that the only place left in the physical world for consciousness is to be built in from the beginning. If you can't find a way to introduce it midway through the story, it must have been there from the start. What evidence do we have, this then raises the question, what evidence do we have for assuming that humans are the only conscious creatures, or maybe a few other complex animals? What reason do we have for assuming that the universe was ever purely physical? And the philosopher Galen Strawson kind of likes arguments from authority, I think, because he cites a whole bunch of historical figures that have come to this same conclusion. So John Locke, Joseph Priestley, Arthur Eddington, Bertrand Russell, and Noam Chomsky, he argues, have each come to the conclusion in their own time that, and I quote, "We have no good reason to think that we know anything about the physical, such that it rules out the idea that it might contain a consciousness." And Strawson goes on to affirm, with physicalists, that your mind really is just neurons firing, but there's a lot of a hell more to neurons than we normally think. So that's how he frames it. So this is, that's how I'm going to end my section on the arguments for panpsychism. And I want, before I conclude, to reflect on where I think my work, maybe the work of others interested in this area, needs to go next. And that's in dialogue with indigenous cosmologies. So as David Scribina has very ably shown in his book, Panpsychism in the West, it was actually the first book I read on panpsychism. Contrary to popular belief, panpsychism has been a persistent aspect of Western philosophy. It just fell out of fashion in the late 19th and early 20th century. But through process thought, even then, it still hung around in the, kind of in the wings. But of course, there are many other cultures and philosophies beyond the Western world that never lost this view of nature. It never fell out of fashion. And these cultures have far more experience, or at least recent experience, reflecting on the implications of panpsychism for spirituality and ethics. In short, I hope that my work clears the ground for Western Christians to take panpsychism seriously and affirm it, but I think where it needs to go next is into sustained conversation with indigenous theologians, and certainly, and in this process, to take the posture of a student. And to that end, I'm extremely grateful to Eugene Fui-Ma-Onoi. Is that okay, Eugene? Okay, thank you. I'm going to say it a couple of times, so hopefully I'll get better. Yeah. Who is a PhD student in theology at Otago University and a student support advisor at Carey Baptist College, for his willingness to engage with my work, which will be published in a forthcoming essay in the journal Religious Studies. Fui-Ma-Onoi argues that theological panpsychism, and I quote him, is not wholly transferable into indigenous thought, but there are important points of congruence. And what I find particularly challenging in his engagement with my work is, for all the points of congruence, and he points out that still my method, my assumptions, the arguments that we've been summarizing this evening are very rarely going to be shared. The assumptions behind the arguments are very rarely going to be shared by indigenous people, and that's because many of these assumptions have been used to oppress and marginalize indigenous people and knowledges. And at one particular point, I suggest in my book, much now to my shame, that theological panpsychism should be seen as an acceptable alternative to animism, using that in an uncritical, derogative way. And Fui-Ma-Onoi writes, and I quote him now at length, that if Leidenhag were to engage more explicitly with animism, and also the indigenous thought worlds in which animism has become a catchphrase, then she might discover that there's no real need for an alternative to animism, but simply a better understanding of indigenous ways of thinking. Further, by finding how her views overlap with certain aspects of indigenous thought, she will also discover voices that will help her deepen and sharpen her thinking. And I think this invitation to dialogue is important. I think it could be pivotal, not only for the discussions of Christian Maori theology dialogue, but also for discussions of Western science, philosophy, and Mataranga Maori, more widely. Such issues were not on my radar in the slightest when I started this project, or even when the point came for publication. But Fui-Ma-Onoi, it's a bit of a slower, is right that engagement with indigenous ways of thinking will do nothing but sharpen my thinking and further expand our knowledge of the creaturely, creation-wide congregation of which we are but humble members. So I feel like there's a lot more work to be done at the intersection of panpsychism and Christian theology, and what I really hope I've achieved this evening is just to show you that it's work worth doing. And that there's a rich potential in a number of different ways for Western and indigenous knowledges to come together on this topic. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, I'd love to take questions. Head for the question.
If you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll give this to you.
Kia ora, I just want to say thank you. That was amazing. Thank you for all your work, and I'm amazed as well that your talk tonight has stopped there, because I'm even more eager to hear more than I was when I arrived here first tonight. But yeah, I recognise that as a form of invitation to us as your audience to turn away from listening to you and instead to turn, as you suggest, to Indigenous cosmologists and leaders in that space. So thank you for that. I have a couple of questions, but I'll hand the mic over after a small one. Oh, yeah, actually, I'll hand it over after the koi one. You started by saying that you started your systematic theology studies looking for models for the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, and then speculated whether, well, let me know if you would have succeeded in finding that. I wonder whether in some way you have actually landed at exactly that in the form of theological panpsychism. So if I could form a question on that, it would be, do you have thoughts that today relate your research to the question of models for understanding the indwelling of the Holy Spirit?
Do I need the mic back? Or? Yeah, thank you for that question. Oh, I love it when questions are just like, you know, the other chapter of the book you didn't talk about this evening? Tell us about that. You didn't know maybe you were asking me that question, but you were. So, there was a chapter of the book that didn't get mentioned this evening, which was a chapter on divine action and what panpsychism can help us with in the divine action debate. And my conclusion in that chapter is that my argument is that panpsychism is really compatible with all sorts of theories and accounts of divine action, but the one thing that it brings to all of them is a way to think about God's indwelling creation, and in a sense, a form of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit in all things. So the expansion of the doctrine of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, as it's normally understood to just be received upon conversion or baptism or some point around that, and expand that out. That said, so yes, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit features in my theological panpsychism in this creation-wide way, but I'm not sure I've come yet to a model of how to articulate that more precisely, which is what I was looking for in the original research. But I will point you towards the work of a colleague of mine, Kimberly Kroll. She's an American female systematician, and she's written a PhD. We were writing PhDs exactly the same time on exactly the same topic, and she didn't give up. And she came up with some really cool ideas and outputs of that, so I would point you towards her work.
Thank you.
Hi. I had a question about the section of your talk where you talking about the explanatory inadequacy of emergent hysteresis. I wasn't quite convinced of the implied inference you made between the failure of emergent hysteresis to Christian theism or theism.
Oh yeah.
I think you just made that comment in passing. So the question I had was, why do you assume that inference? Because I would argue, not here, but I could argue elsewhere that perhaps pantheistic or panentheistic theologies or theories would be a better inference to make from the failure of emergent hysteresis rather than, you know, Christian classical theism or classical theism as people usually understand it, right?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so if I've understood your the bit you're talking about correctly, that by rejecting emergence theory, I think that panpsychist philosophers like Galen Strawson have invited theism, backed themselves into theism. Yeah. It's specifically the way that they reject emergence theory. So he goes really hard against emergence theory as an explanation for consciousness by saying that you can't, by appealing to the principle of sufficient reason, and by appealing to the idea that you can't get something from nothing. And when you look at the history of the arguments for the existence of God, those exact two principles are essential to cosmological arguments for the existence of God. They're the basis of those arguments. So and often the ways that atheistic philosophers of religion will try and get out of these cosmological arguments is to go after the principle of sufficient reason, or to go after the principle that you can't get something from nothing. So it's not the only way, but it's been a very common tactic. So my argument has been, by doubling down on those principles in order to defeat emergence theory, Galen and Strawson has inadvertently doubled down on arguments for the existence of God, if that makes sense. So the reason that I at least don't yet see how your argument that pantheism or panentheism might work better is because the argument I'm making is specifically an argument about creation, about the act of creation, as it were, about where does the universe come from, and therefore ties into the distinction between God and creation that I see the pantheist and the panentheist theologian blurring, right, wanting more integration between God and creation. Yeah, that's my response. Thank you very much for pushing me on that.
Hi, I have to apologise, I'm not a scientist, so I don't understand some of the words. I've come from quite a traditional background where God was there and we were here, God in creation. And then over the last few years, a few decades, I've been influenced by a UK beautiful Catholic priest called Avery Smith, who I don't know if you've come across. And he introduced me to the term of panentheism, which Samuel mentioned. That to me resonates, where we don't have a God up there and us as matter or whatever down here, but there's a merging where we're all part of this beautiful universal consciousness. And there's a kind of separation, but there kind of isn't, and yeah, it's quite amazing. So I've been won over to Adrian Smith's view of panentheism, and it really resonates with me. My question is, I've never heard before tonight the term panpsychism, and I must admit I'm still confused. I don't understand the difference between panentheism and panpsychism.
Thank you for that question. So just start with the last bit. Panpsychism is a theory that consciousness is everywhere, and you can be an atheist, or a theist, or a pantheist, and affirm that. Does that make sense? It's just a theory about the mind, about consciousness. And panentheism, obviously, as you know, is a theory that the universe is in God, and God is in the universe. So that makes claims about God, and panpsychism makes claims about the mind. That said, quite a lot of panentheists like panpsychism, and quite a lot of panpsychists quite like panentheism. And there's a book on that called Panpsychism and Panentheism. It's an edited volume with a whole bunch of people who, like you, feel that these two things should maybe go together. I have two complaints against panentheism, so I don't like the combination of these positions. My first complaint is that I don't think it's a stable position. I think it wibble-wabbles, to use the technical term, between pantheism or kind of traditional theism, and it sets up a boogeyman in traditional theism by thinking that it's just deism, by thinking that God created the universe and then checked out. And I think but very few Christian theists. There were a few deists in England in the 17th century, but in the 18th century. But for the most part, Christian theology is not deistic. It has always affirmed God's presence in God's temple, God's incarnation, God's indwelling of God's people, and God walking in the garden, for example, in the Genesis stories. So I don't think we need pantheism. I think we've got lots of God in creation and interacting in what I would just call traditional theism. So that's kind of one complaint. And the second complaint is, if that's not good enough and you want an even closer integration of creation, and you want, then I would just think that's probably pretty close to pantheism at that point. So I don't think there's any conceptual space left between normal Christian theism, as I think of it, and pantheism for pantheism to live. So that's the flippy-floppy between the two, because I don't think there's any space there. And I don't think we should be pantheists broadly because of things like the problem of evil, and I just don't think it's compatible with a God that's a creator and transcendent and can save us. I think if God is the universe and entangled with the universe, then there's not much hope left. So broadly speaking, that's where I sit in all those issues very quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna. I had a question just about an alternative explanation to your overall position. Now, your overall position, you're saying that given the way things are now, and especially the phenomenon of consciousness and so on, we have to think the very beginning, the lowest level, differently. And you're suggesting that we should put something like experience or consciousness right down there at the elemental level. And I suppose the shocking quality of panpsychism is that it's sort of taking this thing which is so vivid to us, even though we may not understand too much about it, and then to kind of just put it down at the level of an element, and it's the shock of it. It's also the implausibility of it as well, and there's a danger there. Once one starts talking about something like experience down at the level of an element or something, that we so modify the concept that it doesn't sort of mean what it seemed to, and it doesn't shock us anymore, whereas panpsychism should be a shocking theory if it's going to be a decent theory. Now, I was wondering what you would think, what you thought about another long tradition, which does something of the same thing, but is much more modest down at the elemental level, in that it doesn't talk about experience or consciousness down there, but it does talk about something else there, which certainly goes against the scientific naturalist view of such things, and it's indirectedness. That there's a kind of teleological direction, even to an element, and that then gets kind of articulated in whole entities that we call living things, and that then that consciousness is a kind of further articulation, a type of indirectedness. In fact, it's a way of relating to things and so on. And so, what do you think of the Aristotelian tradition in regard to what you're saying?
Having you around, it gives me a moment. Thank you. Yeah, so I think it's. I think the question is going to be whether or not you can have directedness, interdirectedness, without experience or not. And I feel I can make even less sense of interdirectionists without experience than I can of experience at the basic level. I can't see how we can disentangle them.
Okay. What about plants?
Oh yeah.
Might we not see plants as an example of indirectedness? And most people would think without consciousness, and at least it's an example that's kind of there in front of us.
Yeah, I think plants are absolutely essential for getting panpsychism going. I think animals are too obvious and rocks are just no. So plants are really important, plants and sponges and other things like that, who we definitely think are alive, and we can see them interacting with their environment, and they seem to have, as you say, kind of goals, to live, to grow. But I think the more we learn about plants, the more it looks like they're experiencing the world. More easy it becomes, for me at least, it becomes to say that photosynthesis could have an experiential aspect to it. It's not like the human one, so it's really hard for us to describe. But there's something it's like to be a plant that's not really anything like it's to be a human or animal, or at least not. It seems plausible to me. And the more we learn about plant communication, the more plausible it looks. So I'm happy to think that trees and plants have experience.
I do want to say that about elements as well.
Yeah, but just as, I do want to say that about elements, but just as just as or at least higher complex level animal consciousness isn't going to be the same as plant consciousness. It's going to get harder and harder to put words to it, and harder because it's further and further, as you said at the beginning of your question, further and further from the type of experience that we all intimately know well. So it's going to be harder and harder to describe. And obviously the other point that I'm surprised no one has yet asked me is if there's, in a sense, so I do think it's tied to living things, because I think what we call life is also an integration or a unifying process. So I don't think rocks, qua rock, or chair, qua chair, is alive and conscious. But I think the elements that make up the chair are, but they're not interacting with each other.
Oh, so you're saying that elements are not consciousness or
no, they
experience?
are, yeah. I'm not talking about elements, but whatever the basic level of reality is, quarks, electrons, sort of thing. Yeah.
We're doing rocks down just because they're slow.
If you can show me that a rock can move of its own directionality, then I will change my view on that matter.
Well, let's give it up for Dr. Leidenhag. Called Krista Togwigwa, and I was alluded to by Emma earlier. My name is Krista McCurland. I lecture at Carey Baptist College, and I just want to thank you, Joanna, for coming thousands of kilometers to be with us tonight, and also Nicola, Emma, New Zealand Christians in Science. We ended up having some funding within a grant project that we've been working on together with three of us and some others in the room. And Joanna leapt at the chance to come back out here, having been here last July. And so at very short notice, she was able to come out, and also Nicola was able to organize this event. So thank you all for coming out today on International Women's Day. It's been a joy to be with y'all. So thank you so much for being here. Nicola, do you need to say anything else?
No, that's perfect. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Yes.
Awesome. Right, y'all enjoy.